Many of the stories we've read throughout the semester focused on the relationship between mothers and their children. There are many different types of relationships examined and many different roles of mothers expressed in the stories themselves. Um, a lot of the stories that we read focused on how the mother feels as a mother rather than how children felt about their mother. And some of these stories included Everyday Use by I believe it was Alice Walker. Alice Walker. Um, A Bronsonville Mother Loiters in Mississippi, Meanwhile a Mississippi Mother Burns Bacon by Gwendolyn Brooks. And Wishes for Sons by Lucille Clifton. One of my personal favorites that we read this semester was Everyday Use by Alice Walker. I'd actually previously read it for other classes, but coming back to this story as a different person who's been through different experiences, I picked up on different things in this story this time around. But the main topic in this story is the mother's relationship to her two daughters, Maggie and Dee. Maggie is described as she walks lamely. It's said in the story that she walks almost like a dog who's been hit by a car. Her mother says how she's not the most beautiful, she's not the brightest, but she is kind and she's very smart about the family's history and the family's stories themselves. Dee, on the other hand, is definitely the more flashy sister. She's beautiful, she was always courted by different boys. The church raised money to send her to school. She was very well liked, always very popular. Whereas Maggie was not as popular, and she also held physical scars from their past. When their house had burned down, the narrator says how Maggie is still physically scarred from the house burning down, but Dee was very happy when the house burned down. She said how she hated the house, and the mother also thinks that Dee hates Maggie herself. But going back to the mother's relationship with the two girls, in the beginning of the story, it is very clear that the mother favors Dee over Maggie. She goes on in this big, long thought about, she always imagined Dee being on one of those Made It shows where people show celebrities who grew up in poverty and they've worked their way up the social ladder, and then they have their parents come in and their parents look beautiful, and she gets to ride in a limo and meet Johnny Carson, and Dee will be so happy to see her, and that's always been her dream for her and Dee, was for Dee to succeed and Dee to come back and still love her mother. Maggie, on the other hand, she's like, yeah, she's okay. She'll likely marry one of the local boys. She'll settle down. She'll live a very similar life to what the mother herself lived. And then in the story, Dee comes back home as a changed person. She now goes by the name Wangaro Lee Zanika Kermanjo is how I think it's pronounced. I will call her Dee throughout the remainder of this video presentation just because it is easier for me to pronounce and faster. So Dee comes back and she has rejected the name that her mother had given her, and says that it's because she's more enlightened about their past and the past of slavery and the past of African Americans as a whole. And she's taking pictures of the house and of Maggie and the mother in the house, and pictures of Maggie and the mother, and pretty much showing like where she came from without being part of it. And then she goes in the house and she starts taking things that she wants. She wants things that were handmade by her relatives, even though she doesn't know what they are or how they're used. She wants to have them for her house so she can show them off. She wants to show off her history, show off where she comes from without knowing the background, the true background. Whereas Maggie knows the stories. You point something out to Maggie and she can tell you Uncle so-and-so made that and they called him this, that was his nickname, and he made it for so-and-so, and she knows the history. She knows the personal side of their family history, whereas Dee knows the facts. She knows that they were African Americans and their ancestors were enslaved, and she actually says that she renounces the name Dee because it's a white name. And the mother gets very upset because she says, no, you were named after my sister, who was named after our mother, who was named after her mother. And Dee says pretty much, but where did that name come from? And she's implying that it was given to her as a white slave name, and that's why she doesn't want it. And the two very different relationships that the mother has with Dee and Maggie both show the mother's growth in the story. At first, she idolizes Dee and her ability to climb the social ladder, and that's everything she wants for her daughters, and she wants them to grow up and be the best and have all these opportunities that she never had. And that's very important to her, and that's why she idolizes Dee over Maggie for a majority of the story, because that's what she wants, and that's what she wants for them. Whereas when she becomes disillusioned with Dee because she just wants to show off her history, she doesn't want to know the history, she doesn't care to learn about it, she doesn't care to say this is my history, she just wants to show it off and to not use any of this stuff that she wants to take from the house. She starts to see the beauty in Maggie, which is that she is true to herself and that she's more reflective of her mother and their history, and that she represents more of not caring what others think, just valuing yourself because you are who you are, and for speaking your own truth and living your truth. And that's evident in the fact that Dee, specifically in the quilt, there's these two quilts that Dee wants that were handmade by their grandmother from old dresses that she had. And she wants to hang it up on a wall. And the mother's like, no, I promised those to Maggie for when she gets married. And Dee says that Maggie will waste it because she's going to actually use them every day. And the mother says, well, that's the point. And this is really, these relationships between the mother and Maggie and the mother and Dee are really evident of how the mother sees herself at different points and how the mother wants to be seen and what the mother values. So in her relationship to Dee, it shows almost like her more materialistic wants, and her want to climb the social ladder and to be more. But then she looks at Maggie, and yeah, she's basically is like, Maggie's not the prettiest, she's not the best, she's not the most literate, but she's kind and she knows her history. And it's really what I found interesting was these different relationships show different attitudes towards family histories. And whereas Dee is very much wants to show off her history but not acknowledge it as hers or take it on personally, whereas Maggie actually lives this. Like it's like when you grow up in a second generation household and you actually speak the language and you know the customs, or you just say that that's what you are just so that people find you more interesting, because that's really what Dee's trying to do with taking all these things from her old house and taking all the pictures of the old house. Is she wants people to think that she's interesting and that she's almost like a better example of an African American, because this is where she came from, but this is where she is now. Whereas Maggie is just, this is who I am. She's not trying to live for anyone else. She's just living for herself. And the mother's relationship with them really shows how her relationship is with the world. Whereas Maggie shows being true to yourself, and Dee shows a future of possibilities by turning your back on where you came from. And I think that the mother's relationship with the two sisters kind of eggs them on to be this way. Like, the mother pushes Dee to go to that school when they get the money from the church, and she pushes Dee to go out there and she always lets her have the nicest dresses, but she kind of looks at Maggie like she's just there. She's not really anything special. She's just Maggie, which there's nothing wrong with just being Maggie. But the mother thinks back about the house that they had that burned down where Maggie got injured. And she says how Dee hated that house, and for some time she thought Dee hated Maggie. And I think it's because Maggie and Dee, specifically for the mother, represent two very different ends of the spectrum. Whereas Dee represents social mobility and moving up in the world, whereas Maggie represents where Dee represents moving up in the world and social mobility, even though by turning her back on her heritage and where she comes from and her family, whereas Maggie represents staying true to your identity no matter what, and always being true to yourself and your family history and knowing your roots and owning those roots. And the mother's relationship with the two girls really affects how the girls are later on in life, because when they're growing up, Dee is given everything she wants. She gets to go to the new schools, she always wore nice clothes, and now she thinks she's entitled to everything in the house because she wants to show off where she comes from without acknowledging the history of where she comes from. Whereas she's always kind of been, don't want to say harsher, because she's not harsh to Maggie, but she is more, she limits Maggie more. She thinks, oh, well, she'll just marry the guy in town and they'll be happy and that'll be okay. So I think that the mother's relationship with Dee and Maggie really show how a mother's impression of her children can affect them and how it makes them grow up differently from each other and affects how they act as adults and how they behave in different situations and how they present themselves to the broader world. So, in that sense, the mother's relationship with her daughters really is the basis of who they are, but it also shows who the mother wants to be and how that changes throughout